So it takes 47 numerical probabilities to specify the joint, compared to 65,000 if we didn't have the graph-like structure. I think this example really illustrates the advantage of compact Bayes network representations over unstructured joint representations. The next concept I'd like to teach you is called D-separation. And let me start the discussion of this concept by a quiz. We have here a Bayes network, and I'm going to ask you a conditional independence question. Is C independent of A? Please tell me yes or no. Is C independent of A given B? Is C independent of D? Is C independent of D given A? And is E independent of C given D? So C is not independent of A. In fact, A influences C by virtue of B. But if you know B, then A becomes independent of C, which means the only determinant to C is B. If you know B for sure, the knowledge of A won't really tell you anything about C. C is also not independent of D, just the same way C is not independent of A. If I learn something about D, I can infer more about C. But if I do know A, then it's hard to imagine how knowledge of D would help me with C, because I can't learn anything more about A than knowing A already. Therefore, given A, C and D are independent. The same is true for E and C. If we know D, then E and C become independent. In this specific example, the rule that you can apply is very, very simple. Any two variables are independent if they're not linked by just unknown variables. So for example, if we know B, then everything downstream of B becomes independent of anything upstream of B. E is now independent of C, conditional on D. However, knowledge of B does not render A and E independent. In this graph over here, A and B connect to C, and C connects to D and to E. So let me ask you, is A independent of E? A independent of E given B? A independent of E given C? A independent of B? And A independent of B given C? And the answer to this one is really interesting. A is clearly not independent of E, because through C we can see an influence of A to E. Given B, that doesn't change. A still influences C despite the fact we know B. However, if we know C, the influence is cut off. There's no way A can influence E if we know C. A is clearly independent of B. They're different entry variables. They have no incoming arcs. But here's the caveat. Given C, A and B become dependent. So whereas initially A and B were independent, if we give C, they become dependent. And the reason why they become dependent, we've studied before. This is the explain away effect. If we know, for example, C to be true, then knowledge of A will substantially affect what we believe about B. If there's two joint causes for C, and we happen to know A is true, we will discredit cause B. If we happen to know A is false, we'll increase our belief for the cause B. That was an effect we studied extensively in the happiness example I gave you before. The interesting thing here is we are facing a situation where knowledge of a variable C renders previously independent variables dependent. This leads me to the general study of conditional independence in Bayes networks, often called D-separation or reachability. D-separation is best studied by so-called active triplets and inactive triplets, where active triplets render variables dependent and inactive triplets render them independent. Any chain of three variables like this makes the initial and final variable dependent if all variables are known. However, if the center variable is known, that is, it's behind the conditioning bar, then this variable and this variable become independent. So if you have a structure like this and it's quote-unquote cut off by a known variable in the middle, that separates or deseparates the left variable from the right variable, and they become independent. Similarly, Any structure like this renders the left variable and the right variable dependent unless the center variable is known, in which case the left and right variable become independent. Another active triplet now requires knowledge of a variable. This is the explain away case. If this variable is known for a Bayes network that converges into a single variable, then this variable and this variable over here become dependent. Contrast this to the case where all variables are unknown. A situation like this means that this variable on the left and on the right are actually independent. In a single final example, we also get dependence if we have the following situation. A direct successor of a convergent variable is known. So it is sufficient if a successor of this variable is known. The variable itself does not have to be known. And the reason is, if you know this guy over here, we need to get knowledge about this guy over here, and by virtue of that, the case over here essentially applies. If you look at those rules allow you to determine for any Bayes network whether variables are dependent or not dependent given the evidence you have. If you color the nodes dark for which you do have evidence, then you can use these rules to understand whether any two variables are conditionally dependent or not. So let me ask you for this relatively complicated Bayes network the following questions. Is F independent of A? Is F independent of A given D? Is F independent of A given G? And is F independent of A given H? Please mark your answers as you see fit. And the answer is yes, F is independent of A. What we find by our rules of D separation is that F is dependent on D and A is dependent on D, but if you don't know D, you can't govern any dependence between A and F at all. Now, if you do know D, then F and A become dependent. And the reason is B and E are dependent given D, and we can transform this back into dependence of A and F because B and A are dependent and E and F are dependent. There's an active path between A and F which goes across here and here because D is known. Now if we know G, the same thing is true because G gives us knowledge about D and D can be applied back to this path over here. However, if we know H, that's not the case. So H might tell us something about G, but it doesn't tell us anything about D, and therefore we have no reason to close the path between A and F. The path between A and F is still passive even though we have knowledge of H.